Hello, and welcome to DataOpticon. So my name's Simon Whiteley. I'm a data platform MVP from the UK, and I'm one of the owners of a company called Advancing Analytics, and we're consultants who help people do advanced analytics, shockingly enough. And personally, I do lots of engineering. I do lots of building out lakes, of building Spark jobs, of lots and lots of data factory, of building out MPP databases using things like Azure SQL Data Warehouse or Synapse Analytics. And it's an interesting time. So you're at DataOpticon, therefore you want to know about DataOps. And it's a big, big term. Lots of people are talking about this thing called DataOps, and not everyone knows what it is. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what DataOps is, how it relates to traditional DevOps, and more importantly, how the various different people working inside the data organization work with this whole DataOps thing, what it actually means to the people on the ground actually doing analytics and pushing out value to the business. And that's a key word, value. So we're going to talk about value and talk about how that actually affects people. Now, apologies, I'm not there in person today. Obviously, I can't be there in person because whole things going on, but it's also my birthday. So I'm off doing birthday things, enjoying myself, so you'll have to make do with a recording. Okay, onwards. So what does the data organization do? And it's to do with value, right? That's why we've got gold bars everywhere. So we're delivering value to the business. That's the whole point of data organizations within companies. So we've got these guys. We've got our report consumers. And they are our business people who need some kind of value. They might be the board, they might be various people in marketing, it could be anyone in any business function who uses data in their day-to-day job is essentially a report consumer. Now they might not be that data savvy. They might be looking at this giant pile of data going, I don't know what to do, it's not my job to sift through it, I don't know how to query that data. And so a lot of the time we're doing something to that data to take it from its raw data, turn it into value. We're trying to turn data into value that people can actually use. And that's great. Now, how do we do that? Normally, it's through some kind of data platform. Now, a data platform, it's a great term. It might be one amazing, slick, brand new lake house kind of thing. It might be a whole collection of access databases. Whatever your data platform is, whatever form it takes, however many different silos there happens to be, it exists for that same reason. It exists to take data, turn it into some kind of value, deliver it to our report consumers. Now, the people actually making this value happen, the people turning the crank and making sure it keeps going, are our people in our data organization. Essentially, it's us. I'm going to have a talk about the different roles that are emerging and how they work differently and how data ops means different things to each of them. But we'll bring all that together. But first, let's take a step back. Let's talk about traditional development. Let's talk about essentially how most people see application development. And it's this kind of thing, saying I've got my dev, I've got my tests, I've got my production, I've got my bronze, silver, gold, whatever you want to call it. This whole essentially conveyor belt of production-ready code. So I'm going away, I'm developing something. When it's finished, I move on to its next thing. It gets tested. Goes through various different test cycles. I might have various different test platforms, UAT, that kind of thing. And then I eventually get my code into production. And when it's in production, people can use it and people can get value. So that whole chain of pushing data through, I'm not really getting value at those points. And that's where DevOps comes in. That whole process. So much of it is about just trying to minimize any blockers, trying to make that slick. Trying to say, well, actually, you don't need to talk to different teams to get around these various infrastructure problems. Trying to say, well, let's just automate a lot of the testing. It's just trying to say that process of saying, I'm writing some code, when can I actually use it to deliver value to the business? And DevOps is so much about that. Now, the core mistake is people believing that's how data operations works. And it's not. We simply don't necessarily build solutions that way. Now, we build parts of solutions like that. I'm not being entirely criminal and saying we don't have dev and test environments, but it's not the whole platform that follows that single rigid process. And it depends on who you are in that data organization as to whether you agree with me or not. So, our various different people that we've got. So we've got a data engineer, me, building out rigid, structured, very kind of audited data pipelines. I'm trying to be efficient. I'm writing good code. I'm trying to make sure I'm getting rid of all of the main, big, hairy, big data style problems so that no one else has to worry about it. There's a lot that goes into data engineering to make it as slick and reliable and structured as possible. I want to reduce the amount of dev effort it takes me to onboard new data, to clean data, to get data out to the other 3 people on the screen. I've got my data analyst. That does not really care about a lot of that stuff. More reactive, responding to the business. People are going and collaring them and saying, I need a new report. Tell me how this works. The sales last week were down. Go and find out why. And that's not going through this formal process. This is much more ad hoc and interactive, a lot more experimental. And then you get really experimental with the data scientist. They are doing full exploratory data analysis, bringing in lots of other data sets. They're diving into various different parts of the data that we didn't actually think there was any value in to begin with, but they can find value there. They're producing machine learning models and then keeping those models running. And there's a whole different way of working around producing models than there is about producing a stable pipeline. And then we've got a BI developer. Kind of sits somewhere in the middle. Some ad hoc requests, some stable models, some reports that have to go out every Monday morning or someone's going to get shot. We have to have that combination. And so all of them think about this whole idea of what is production very differently. So we're going to put this in the context of the kind of modern data platform. So we're going to take that data platform, zoom into it a little bit, and we get this kind of view. So we get the idea of, I've got some source data. I'm pulling from various different sources. I'm pulling it into a lake, some kind of semi-structured, unstructured data store that's very good for massively parallel querying of the data. I can suddenly throw compute at it and do big spikes of compute. But it's not as easy for people to interrogate and join things together, and you need some special skills to work with some of that data. And then, to make data easier to work with, we're putting it into a relational engine. We're putting it into a traditional SQL Kimball-style warehouse, if that's your thing. Essentially, we have this rigid, structured, auditable, reliable warehouse that we can pin a lot of our organizational reporting on. And then we have things like Power BI or Tableau or Click or whatever your reporting tool of choice is, where we do that next stage of semantic models and adding KPIs and allowing people to self-serve their analytics. And that still needs thought about what's live, what's not live, what's prod, what data does it use. So this is the context that we're working in, this whole 7 steps of data. This is what I call a data platform these days. But as I said, yours may be very different. So let's go back to that main question of who does what in this architecture for this modern data platform. How are people working differently, and why is this thing DataOps? Can't I just have dev, test, and live? So going back to our architecture, let's talk first about the data engineer. So there he is, there I am. And I've got 3 different copies of my data. Because it's not just my platform that has dev, test, and UAT, but pretty my source systems have dev, test, and UAT. And there's a whole question of, do I dev on dev, or do I dev on test, or do I do dev based on prod data? And that is a whole other argument, or a whole other decision. Largely, it depends on whether or not you're allowed to have production data in your dev system. I mean, generally, if your source system dev area is constantly changing and it's volatile because they're doing development, you don't want to be trying to dev on top of that, because it's essentially a moving target. But you might not have the choice. So that's one bit of complexity we're not even going to get into. And then the main question, if I've got my dev area when I'm designing my new pipelines, I'm building out new data quality routines, I'm building out orchestration methods of shunting my data into that warehouse. I mean, so I have a dev platform that is changing, that is augmented, that is growing over time. And yes, I have a test platform for that. Yes, I have a production platform for that. And so that's fairly traditional. That is following that flow of code from I'm building out certain objects, doing some data factory, I'm doing some data bricks, I'm building out these pipelines to process my early stage data, and I promote that code. I send that into test. I run a load of tests. I might do a load of automated tests. Hopefully using a load of things like Azure DevOps or GitLab Actions, and I'm pushing through and automating a lot of the testing of that. And then if I'm happy, I can just push a release and push that code, promote it out to production. So that's nice, fairly traditional. It's a formal framework development workflow. And the reason I say framework is because so many of those bits and pieces should be generic, reusable libraries, chunks of code that I can use many, many times. I don't want to have to do that whole stage every time there's a new data set. If someone says, hey, we had customers, we've now split it into customers and customers extension, I don't want to have to go back and do a whole load of code workflow to get that out there. I want to be developing a platform, a framework that separates out the processing of data from the tools I use to do that. But yeah, DevOps tooling to push this stuff through is very, very important. This has to work properly and has to be quite slick. So that's me pushing out the framework objects, but as an engineer, I'm also doing additional data. So I've got my prod data. Every day, every hour, every minute, I might be doing data loads. So I'm onboarding new data, and obviously that doesn't go through that same... I'm not testing every bit of data that goes in. So you have this idea that you've got your production release, and then while it's released, it's just this constant shifting data sets going through, being processed, being onboarded. And if we're doing it right, and this is very metadata driven, it's very configurable, then actually I can bring on new data sources without doing a code deployment. I can just change some metadata. It can handle new different types of data coming in, and if it's fully configurable, I can do things like add new data quality rules, include new screens, add new steps in the process without actually having to change too much of the code. That can all be metadata. So again, I've got this big split of my traditional code, which is going through formal dev, test, UAT, being pushed through using DevOps deployment pipelines and all of that stuff. And then I've got my live value pipeline. I've got my data just evolving and growing in an entirely separate, different way. So I've got value added outside of my development workflow. That alone is fairly confusing from a DevOps formal, this is how code works point of view. That's one of the fundamentals of why DataOps is a fairly... It's earned its own separate word because you have complexities like this. So that's one. That's our data engineer. We switch and have a look at our analyst. So I don't do some exploratory analyst on my dev data or my test data. I'm actually only focused on prod. So I'm developing on prod. Now you can argue I'm not really developing because I'm actually going through and writing queries and just essentially just querying data. But it is a querying language. I'm producing valuable artifacts which I deliver through to the business. That's still an act of some kind of development. And again, that's something that's missed in that classic DevOps story of things are going to change and things are going to work on dev. Now I might have a lab, I might be doing some sandboxing, I might be pulling some data together to actually work out my results. But I'm following an informal or an ad hoc development workflow. I might probably not using sprints, I'm not using Scrum. I might be using Kanban just to pick things off the list. I might be running around just talking to the business and working with them in however they're working, not however I want to work. So the dev approach is very different, and I'm not really deploying anything. I'm writing a notebook, pulling in some results, and then showing it to people. So my DevOps tools aren't really that relevant, but it's still a key part of that data organization. It's still part of the story. Okay, next we've got Power BI and kind of semantic reports and the whole BI analyst space. Now I can do it like this. I can say, if I was doing a very, very formal big release and I was onboarding a whole load of data and it's my big production pipeline, then yeah, maybe I build some reports against my dev environment using my dev data. And then I build some test reports, then I build my prod model, I'm just promoting that each time, and that's great. That means I can have separation. I can make sure by the time that they turn on my production data platform, there's some report models ready to go straight away. And so I can do traditional development there. I've got that nice, clean, following the production application lifecycle management. But that's not always the way it works. Sometimes I've got some production data, and I've onboarded some new data, and someone said, oh, actually, can you actually put me together another model? And I'm not going to go whack to dev and have that promoted and wait for stage gates and all of that kind of thing. I'm just going to build it straight on prod. And so I've got this idea, if I'm lucky, of dev, test, and prod directly on production data. And that's not saying I'm just developing in production. It's just I'm using production data to build these models because that's what makes sense. That's how I can test it. That's how I can make sure it's accurate and it matches some data someone else has. You know, if they have a report that's built on production data and they say, can you build a model to match this so I can explore it? I can't build that in dev blind and then hope it matches by the time I deploy it. You get this whole separate, distinct development lifecycle that lives in that prod stream. Again, it's a separate value pipeline than the rest of the formal development one. So again, I've got a different pipeline. It's a very flexible development workflow. These tools are less mature. They don't tend to have quite a formal automated testing, automated deployment pipeline. It tends to be people building it and then manually promoting it to dev, test, UAT, that kind of thing. Deciding, tick, okay, we'll call that one production now. These tools are getting better. They're getting more and more and more real-world development tooling behind it, but it's not quite there yet, and it works in a different stream. It's an unrelated stream. Then finally, we've got our data scientists, which is where it goes even weirder, because the whole process of managing data science is different to the rest of the data organization. So again, I might have my lab, and I'm pulling some data in. I might be getting data from all over the place, some weather data, some stock exchange, whatever my data sets happen to be, and land that in lab outside of that fairly formal data pipeline. So I've got my own separate data stream, as well as pulling data down from the more formal production data platform. I'm taking that, I'm doing some experimentation. So I might try a couple of different models, I'll try a few things, I'll see what I can get the answer as, I'll see what accuracy I get out of my models, and I'll have several different iterations there. And that's not necessarily individual sprints with releases. This is just me trying a few different things and seeing how close I can get. And then eventually, hopefully, we'll reach some kind of accuracy goal. We'll say, I can predict this. I'm confident I can predict this. Let's put this live. Let's use this to score actual real-world data. So I have a release model. And unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. So data science models, they decay. Essentially, if I'm predicting customer behavior, and I do it once, and then I assume that customer behavior is never going to change, in a year or two down the line, I'm going to have a shock when I realize, you know what, everyone's buying behavior is completely different. The market has moved on. Times have changed. And, you know, if I'm talking in years, that's not too bad, but sometimes it's daily. Sometimes it's weekly or monthly. There's a different cadence for model decay depending on the kind of model you're producing. And it's just the fact that people's habits change, the trends in the data change, the thing that you're trying to predict changes constantly. So I might have my first stab at the model, and then I'll have a retraining. I'll give it a new set of data and update it, and then I'll keep that process going. So I'll have my live model, and then various different retrained things which need management. They need this process needs some form of operations. It needs some form of management of the dev pipeline for this. And then I might be looking at it. I've not stopped. I've got this idea of going, well, that was release 1 and we got quite close, but maybe I can do release 2. Maybe there's a different model I could have used. Maybe a different algorithm. Maybe someone's come up with a new improvement that actually performs better, and I want to try using that. And then that'll have its own retraining and life cycle, and that just goes on to model number N, whatever that happens to be. So there's a reason that this whole thing exists as a whole separate development workflow. It's very iterative. It's very flexible and fluid. It needs continuous monitoring and integration and improvement. It's not I finished writing my code, it passed its tests, it's now live. It's now live and we need to keep making sure it is good and gets better. And that's why you have this whole term of ML ops as an entirely separate thing, which for me, I see as part of DataOps because it is a specialist element of it. But again, you see these different terms where it is different enough from the standard traditional DevOps pipeline that we need to make sure people realize it is a different problem. So DevOps is DataOps is just DevOps for data. You see that a lot, and it's not just saying, you know what, you can apply these same DevOps tools to your data platform. It's trying to say there's a different problem. There's a whole different thing that we're trying to do. So this whole idea of saying I've got this DevOps cycle going around, I'm just saying dev, test, prod. Actually, on the other side, I've got DataOps saying there's a value pipeline and innovation pipeline. That's the way that the data kitchen guys describe it. They're saying I've got this whole process flow of value that's separate to the process flow of, they call it innovation. I mean, it's kind of just traditional development for me. In terms of taking our various different people and plugging it into a wider picture, I see something a bit like this. It's quite a big piece with lots going on. So data engineering, sure, I've got dev, test, UAT, release, and prod. I've got a fairly formal release pipeline for my framework elements. And then ongoing feeding of that data pipeline, onboarding new data, actually enriching it entirely separately from my code pipeline. I've got my analysts who just have a whole separate stream of just analyze and deliver, analyze and deliver. Don't worry about DevOps, don't worry about pushing the stuff out. Just constantly use prod. Essentially, the super users actually making the most value out of that production data. I've got my BI guys who will just have an entirely separate stream who might be going dev, test, prod, who might be doing some analyst style things and just putting reports together somewhere in the middle. It depends on their tools, and their tools are constantly changing and updating and are divorced from the rest of the data platform. They can chop and change and choose a different tool, still plug into my main lake or my main warehouse. And so it's very flexible, but very decoupled. And then I've got my data scientists who, I've talked about that iterative model development, and not all models even work that way. And so they've got a whole separate way of working that has to kind of plug into that architecture, plug into that process. But it can be very different. So that is why we're talking about DataOps. That's why we're talking about not just saying it's DevOps and it's DevOps tools and I'm using Azure DevOps with the release pipeline. It's a whole separate way of working, a way of thinking about how we get value out into the organization based on data and the concerns that we need to have about it. So, yeah, that's DataOps. So, hopefully that was useful. Short, sharp, 20 minutes, love it. And yeah, hope you have a great rest of the day. Cheers.